Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Eric. I really appreciate you taking the time. Obviously, you're one of the crypto OGs, and right now you're running ShapeShift, but you've had a long decade almost involved in crypto, and obviously in the initial stages, Bitcoin. For those few who don't know you, would love to get started, just kind of winding back your story, and if you don't mind, even going back before you discovered Bitcoin to kind of how you got started in this type of mindset of corresponding with the values of Bitcoin in the first place.
Yeah, so I guess to go down memory lane a little bit, after college, I moved to Dubai. And while I was over there, the whole financial crisis occurred, back in 2008 and 9. And so, from across the seas, I kind of saw the entire economy falling apart. And I got very interested in finance generally and in monetary economics specifically. I've always been very much libertarian minded, but it was at that time that I sort of put two and two together, which was that, like money itself is probably the most important commodity or good in a market economy, for it to be market based versus, centrally controlled by the government. I had never really had a problem with the dollar or with fiat before that. But it was just sort of one of those epiphanies of like, yeah, of course, if you don't want a monopoly provider of a certain good, especially the government providing a certain good, money more than anything else needs to be handled by a market. But I didn't really know what that solution was, so I got interested in gold, and I started understanding why gold was a great form of money, but also understood why it had been kind of abandoned for a while. And
So
I thought, in a digital age, it's not going to be very practical in any way.
can I interrupt you real quick? So
Yeah.
because there's a few interesting things that have come up already. First of all, briefly, I want to hear what brought you to Dubai. That's obviously like not a super standard place for people to move from the US after
Yeah.
school. Second to that, I want to dig in on this concept that you're laying out, which is, I mean, I heard you recommend what's his name? Murray Rothbard. Is that right?
Hmm.
Yeah, his book, and I actually picked it up and read the first half of it today in prepping for this, and so I'm kind of familiar freshly with this concept, which I had
Yeah.
understood from a distance before, but want to talk about, after you're done explaining Dubai, I want to hear what it means to free money to be operated by the market rather than, try to be controlled by the government.
Yeah. Well, and that's really the central point and purpose of Bitcoin in the first place. But so I moved to Dubai because, after college, I was looking for adventure, and I had heard of this place, this city that had been built out of the desert in a decade, and, the gleaming skyscrapers, and it had no taxes. And it was basically just like a relatively free market city state. Certainly has its problems, was not a panacea or anything, but it was an exciting place to go and, like, start my working life and see what I wanted to do. So I just moved there without any job, and just I got hired by a real estate company doing like real estate marketing, and this was back when they were going through a crazy property boom. So that was, kind of one of my first experiences with speculative bubbles. And then it was, while I was there, that I started watching the whole economy fall apart, and it didn't hit Dubai for about 6 months. So there was a weird, surreal period of time where Dubai was in a boom, and yet, the U.S. was in a severe recession at the same time, and that's what really got me interested in how money works generally.
So then you talk about this concept of freeing it from the government, and you mentioned like you always had this libertarian leaning mindset, maybe, but couldn't really attach it to the fact that money was sort of at the root of that freedom. Can you dig in a little bit more? Like, what do you mean when you say like you had these leanings all along, and
Yeah.
then how did you kind of connect the two?
Yeah, well, what's amazing isn't connecting the two, but what's amazing is having ever not made that connection. But certainly most most libertarians, especially not the less radical ones, the sort of normal libertarians, they're very free market, and they instinctively understand that goods are better produced by an open competitive market than by the government. And they can tell you all the reasons why socialism is problematic and will lead to greater poverty and despair. So they can make all those arguments, and yet they generally do not have any serious contention or concern about the US dollar. And indeed, many of them, implicitly or explicitly see the US dollar as sort of like the symbol of capitalism. And this is actually completely absurd, because the US dollar is a government product. It is a centrally controlled good of the economy, centrally controlled and planned and managed by the US federal government. Not only should it not be the symbol of capitalism, it is antithetical to capitalism. It is the opposite of a market, to have money that is centrally planned and controlled. So I think it's kind of amazing that so few people make that connection. I could understand if all the statists liked fiat money and the free market people didn't, but generally, and especially pre-Bitcoin, free market people generally had no contention with the dollar whatsoever. They might debate what the monetary policy should be or what interest rates should be, but not whether interest rates should be set by the government. That's kind of an untouchable issue. And it's opening up more and more now, but I think that's the result primarily of Bitcoin.
Yeah, and perhaps it was, people couldn't make the connection because it just wasn't, it couldn't be conceived until something flew in their face and said, well, this actually is a reasonable alternative. So you were in Dubai and kind of smack dab in the middle of the financial crisis. You're also working in real estate, so you get an up close and personal view on all of that. You moved back to the States after that?
Yeah. So after 2 years in Dubai, I moved back to Colorado, and then within a few months moved to New Hampshire to join the Free State Project. And at the time, I knew that I wanted to spend a lot of my time and attention on some sort of like social project, some way of advancing the cause of liberty. And at that time, the Free State Project seemed to me the best way to do it. The Free State Project was essentially it still exists and is still slowly growing and moving. An initiative to get a bunch of libertarians, 20,000 people who understand the principles of individual liberty, and move them to a relatively small jurisdiction so that they can have an outsized effect on the actual policies and politics of that area. Because across the US, maybe only 5% of people would identify, very firmly as a libertarian. So they're never going to win any kind of election whatsoever. And this was really just a social experiment to see if an outsized influence could be had by actively bringing a group that large into a state that small. So it was there in New Hampshire that I met a lot of other very radical libertarians. I felt very much at home in that world. And it was there from a friend of mine who I learned about Bitcoin in May of 2011. Kind of ironically, he is now a state representative in New Hampshire, but I first learned of Bitcoin from him.
That's pretty funny. So you go, I want to come back to the Free State project in a little bit, but let's go to Bitcoin. You discover Bitcoin. How quickly do you go from like discovery to putting your life into it?
Like 30 minutes. So like I read a headline of this digital asset that they didn't use the word digital asset. They probably said virtual currency that had appreciated by 500% in a few months. Bitcoin was like $5 at that time. And being a casual student of finance and markets, nothing really grows that fast unless it's a scam or very suspicious for any asset to grow that quickly in a few months. So I clicked on the article and I was reading about it, and I was like, okay, I don't quite get this. Initially thought it was stupid. I found another article, read about it. And then by the third article, whatever it was, caused me to realize the fundamental truth about Bitcoin, which was that it couldn't be stopped or turned off, and no one controlled it. And when I realized that, then I was like, okay, this is something new. Nothing like that exists. There's no system that can't be turned off, especially there's no financial system that can't be turned off. And yet Bitcoin couldn't be. So then I started getting interested, and probably within 30 minutes, I was like completely, not just like on board, but completely enamored. And my life ever since then has just been day and night about Bitcoin. Back then, it was so new and so niche that, you know, there wasn't really an industry. You couldn't go get a job in Bitcoin. You know, the term blockchain was not thrown around at all, other than referenced occasionally from the white paper. So basically, it was just a hobby, and I was like, well, this is the potential solution to that problem that I saw when I was in Dubai, which is like there's no current free market form of money. Any prior attempt, like e-gold, was centralized, and thus could be shut down by the government as soon as it became a threat to fiat. So I had that despair before Bitcoin, and then when I realized that here's an option that can't be turned off, if this thing grows and starts becoming adopted, there is no off button, and that makes it really powerful. And who knows if it'll actually work, but this is worth dedicating time and attention to. So it was a passion and a hobby for a while, and then it ultimately became a career.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you were able to recognize that so early on. Obviously, you hear a lot of stories, people who, you know, were turned onto it from a friend or whatever it might be in 2011 or even years later in like 2013. For me, I think the first time I heard about it was in 2016 and actually did a project on it for school, but still wasn't smart enough to like do anything about it. And, you know, people just kind of ignore it. You recognize very early on that, or not that they ignore it, but they just don't invest the time to really understand it. They assume it's like, you know, like you said, something that appreciates so much in value in such a short period of time, which is usually how it gains recognition in the media and everything like that. People just kind of discount these things as scams or bubbles or whatever it might be. Don't really take the time to learn the fundamentals. You recognize really early on that this could be unstoppable, or possibly was already unstoppable. Would love to hear your perspective, because I think a lot of people look at it today, especially people who have kind of come on board later on, and they're concerned about what the government might be able to do, or a 51% attack. Back then, correct me if I'm wrong, but like this was, you know, at most in the hundreds of millions in terms of market cap, and it's pretty feasible that like, and there wasn't that much computing power, and so it's pretty feasible that someone could have kind of come in and started to dominate the network a little bit. Is that something
Yeah.
that you recognized back then and think has become sort of unfeasible, or is it still something that has some degree of small possibility?
I think back then there were four large areas of concern that we would all debate on the forums, you know, without end. One was the 51% attack issue. Like did the fundamental security model of Bitcoin work? Why or why not? And how risky was that? Would the mining industry consolidate such that it would have to end up with one party controlling it, and how likely was that? Two was what the government would do, and this was actually what I was most worried about, because I knew that like it technically can't be turned off, but the government could certainly make life hell for anyone involved in it. And you know, how heavy-handed and hard would the government and governments come down on this technology? And we debated, you know, what they could do, how they would try to attack it, how they would try to stop it, if they would be the ones trying to implement a 51% attack, you know, if they would try to buy up all the Bitcoin, and whether that would be a good or a bad thing. You know, so we also worried about like whether it actually end up being adopted. Like, will people actually use this, or is this just a tiny little project that a bunch of nerds care about? And so, you know, those were really the main things we discussed. Fortunately, the government issue did not become nearly as problematic as many of us thought. And the reason is that government, even today, still has hubris about their own fiat currency. And the idea that this little cryptocurrency could displace, any fiats, let alone the US dollar, is just so laughable and unrealistic that they do not perceive Bitcoin as an existential threat to fiat currency. And this has really been Bitcoin's greatest advantage, is that skepticism of anyone in government, anyone in professional economics, most of the business community, anyone influential, to acknowledge that Bitcoin is actually not just a theoretical threat, but like is on a destiny of displacing fiat. They just didn't think that way. So at worst, they saw Bitcoin as a way for people to launder money or buy drugs, which is a problem to them, but not an existential problem. And so they have permitted Bitcoin to grow. And at this point, it's arguably unstoppable. There's a point at which it becomes fully unstoppable. Maybe that was 10 years ago, maybe it's today, but it's grown way out of control of anyone.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you talk about the government, I think like from my perspective, obviously not even, degrees of magnitude away from your involvement in history, but I think that the government may have been hesitant to, even just going back 3-4 years ago to the last surge in winter of 17. Obviously, that's the most attention it's ever gotten in its history, and so at that point, the government might be, most until this coming next peak or this coming next surge in popularity and attention. That would have been the time you would have most expected maybe government to comment or to do something and to regulate. And it seems to me that it possibly, to your point, they don't recognize the threat and they're just too blind to it, or they're kind of waiting for something to go wrong in some other way and they don't want to like legitimize it by treating it as a threat almost. And I mean, it doesn't really matter what the reasoning is, but regardless, it seems like it's been fairly friendly to date. There was like
Yes.
a recent rumor. I don't know. I haven't looked too deeply into it, but I saw Brian Armstrong commented on it and Fred Wilson as well, which is that they're considering regulating crypto wallets similarly to bank accounts, that you need to identify the receiver of the currency. Is that
Yeah.
something that concerns you in a big way, in a small way? Not really too big of a deal. What are your thoughts on that?
It concerns me in a medium way. Again, it is from the perspective of a government that is trying to surveil the system effectively. They want Bitcoin to be treated as all the other parts of finance that they can watch easily. And even though they know they can't prevent a single Bitcoin transaction, to the extent that they control most of the custodians, and if most of the crypto is held with custodians, then they effectively control the crypto, and they want to be able to watch and control it. But I still don't think that they understand the actual threat is not just about not being able to be surveilled. It's not one of privacy so much as it is of existential destruction of fiat currency itself. And fiat currency is so fundamentally important to how governments operate today that to challenge fiat currency on an existential level is to challenge the government itself head on at its most important artery. I have not gotten any whiff that the governments worry about it in that sense, and there will come a point where they do. But so far, so good.
So can I ask this? This might be a bit of an ignorant question, but frankly, like I've been wondering it and I haven't really had someone answer it well for me. And you're probably like one of the better people to do so. What if the US or, it could be Russia or China, frankly, a lot of countries, but I'm talking about like the most powerful ones. What if they realized that existential threat and said that, they got a team of really smart people together in the crypto community who were willing to, work for money. And they said, here's a $1 trillion budget, go either kill this thing or get us control or, basically make this stop. What happens in that situation?
Yeah, I think the worst that they can do is set the whole project back, and materially so. I mean, they could destroy a decade of advancement and delay the whole progress by a decade. But in terms of human history, that's nothing. They could, with all the resources they have, they could certainly damage or destroy any single chain for some period of time. But cryptocurrency technology adapts, and it adapts so much faster than the regulators or the government can move. So even if they destroyed Bitcoin, whatever way they destroyed it would be adapted against, and other cryptocurrencies would spawn up. Even if they make it outright illegal for citizens to own, it will just exist in the black market for some period of time. And because fiat currencies are destined to fail anyway, it'll be pulled back and demanded by citizens who ultimately have demand for a form of money that is reliable. And so there's no way to keep the concept of decentralized value out of society. It has been, a genie has come out, and governments can change the trajectory of it, delay its advancement. But the idea is here, and it's so good at what it does, and it's so useful for people to be able to have this uncensorable form of financial value that any two people in the world can transact in without permission, at relatively low cost, without anyone being able to stop it. That is so valuable that there's no way it can be stopped over the long term.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense to me, and kind of aligns with my thinking. I get confused, and I want to be like super clear for, for you and for everyone listening. Like, I'm very bullish on Bitcoin. I'm very bullish on crypto, and everything that, not everything maybe, but the root and the fundamentals of what it all stands for, the type of stuff that we've talked about thus far. Having said that, I think I personally take issue with anyone being unreasonable in any arena. And so, some people who make, I think, irrational claims, such as like that Bitcoin is a guarantee, or that
Yeah.
this certain currency is a guarantee. And, just getting pretty irresponsible in my mind with their language, given that real people working for real money might be following their lead and investing their dollars. And obviously it's up to that person. But what do you make of, I guess, the tribalism that's risen within crypto? I know you've been a pretty staunch supporter of the fact that, like, you're a supporter of multiple currencies if they earn their place in the system to become popular and valuable. But do you observe that even some of the leading horses today could go down, and that, it's this broader vision that everyone in the crypto community should, like you said, it might get delayed, but it should be sort of an inevitability over time, especially like in the context of human history. But the people who kind of ride with a single horse or a few horses or whatever it might be, how do you kind of address those types of people?
Yeah, great question. I think the only thing that is inevitable is the concept of a distributed form of value transfer. And the reason that something like that can be inevitable is because it's an idea. It's like a platonic ideal that does not have flaws to it, and thus will be adopted. But any specific implementation of that idea will have flaws, will have trade-offs, will have design decisions, and is not invulnerable or invincible. Bitcoin certainly has the highest likelihood of remaining the dominant money, and we may well be using it 100 years from now, but it's not guaranteed for sure. And ever since I got involved, I've always tried to remain humble about the fact that the whole thing can fall apart, and any specific implementation can fall apart. And I think to not have that humility is to make the same mistake that the governments are making with their own fiat. Nothing really lasts forever. Everything created by humans is flawed in some way, even if only because of certain design decisions that were important for one reason or another. And certainly anyone who is in the crypto industry and is telling people anything about a sure bet or like guaranteed returns or definitely the best investment you'll ever have, like any of that kind of language is a huge red flag. And usually is usually is promoted by people who are interested in the financial gain, but not really caring deeply or authentically about the underlying social mission of what this stuff is about.
I think that's a great perspective and certainly refreshing for me to hear. At the same time as what you said, these people, they might, and the nature of my question is, why are these people so over the top promoting a single coin or whatever it might be, Bitcoin maximalists and everything? Nothing against them. It's just like it's when it gets over the top that I start to question what's actually going on there. And I think what's interesting is that money has no intrinsic value, right? It's everyone's belief that it has value and as a medium of exchange, or you could argue as a store of value or whatever it might be. That's what gives its worth. Um, and so if
Yeah, I
that
take a
falls,
slightly different position than that, but yeah, finish your thought first.
okay, yeah, I definitely want to hear. I might not have worded that as well as I even meant to, but definitely want to hear your perspective. But um, what I'm getting at is that the belief system itself is very fundamental, along with some, properties and characteristics of the money itself, such as like, gold having an advantage over cows and, Bitcoin maybe having an advantage over gold in certain characteristics. Um, but aside from those characteristics, the belief is really at the root of the value. And so there's this, thought in my mind that these people going over the top, it may be somewhat necessary, and that they're almost, creating its own destiny by keeping that alive long enough so that it can't, until the point where Bitcoin may or may not be at today, where it sort of can't be stopped.
Yeah, very, very interesting way to put it. I agree wholeheartedly on the comment of things not having intrinsic value. Like what I generally say is that things have value to a specific valuer. Whoever is doing the valuing has their own, subjective value that they find in any asset, whether it's a monetary asset or a bicycle or a plate of food. But where I disagree is that, to say that money is just because people believe in it, I think begs the question why they believe in one thing over another. And it isn't really an answer, because, why do people believe in one thing and not a different thing? That's the more important question. And fundamentally, over the long term, the reason to believe in one thing over another as money is because of its attributes, because of the specific properties that asset has. And so you're right that, a lot of the value in a money is because people believe in it, but they believe in it fundamentally because it has utility, because its properties are good. Or if they believe in it and it doesn't have good utility and it doesn't have good properties, it is probably destined to fail. And that's how I feel about fiat. Clearly, nearly everyone in the world believes wholeheartedly in the value of fiat. Is that justified? I think no. The reason they believe in fiat is out of habit. They believe in fiat because fiat used to be gold. Gold used to be the money, and all the paper was just assigned a specific weight of gold. People, for millennia, understood the value of a certain precious metal because of its attributes. And amazingly, in one of the greatest scams or tricks ever perpetrated on humanity, the metal was removed, and then it was just the nothing that was money. And because of the quirks of human society and the lack of education on how money works, and certainly the vested interest that all of the government has in making sure people don't understand how it works, they just continue to believe that the paper currency is valuable, and that will fall apart. Fiat has only been around since the early 70s, 50 years old. It will fall apart because governments debase it in perpetuity, and as that happens, people's belief in what should be money will change from fiat into something whose attributes actually justify the belief.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. I think to try to reconcile a little bit with where I started off, um, I guess belief in the short term, from my perspective, is enough, as you can kind of see from like the legacy belief from the old gold-based system kind of continuing to play out 50 years later on fiat money.
Yeah.
Whereas what you're saying, I totally agree with that. If the attributes aren't there, ultimately it's destined to fail. It's just a question of kind of the time scale. And so I think
Hmm.
that's really interesting. Um, I want to talk a little bit about like the growth of Bitcoin specifically over time, and the fact that it's undergone these huge surges and falls, these hype cycles, similar to like what you'll see from like Gartner with any technology, or at least a large number of technologies, in the way that they've come from early adopters to mass adoption in sort of waves. You've been around and following closely and intimately involved with crypto since the early days, and you've seen more of these rises and falls than most people. Can you talk a little bit about like the nature of what's behind that, and
Yeah.
is that a necessary thing for the evolution in the long term?
Yeah, great question. So when I first learned about it, it was May of 2011. Bitcoin was about $5. By the time I managed to get my hands on any, it was like $8 or $9, still in May. And then later in May, it got up to $31. And that was like, from $5 to $31 in 2 or 3 weeks. Just a ridiculous appreciation. And then that was the first, real bubble in Bitcoin, and it popped. And it's not immediately obvious when a bubble pops, because on the way up, it falls frequently and then comes back and returns. And so, everyone kind of deludes themselves into thinking that the bubble is still around the corner. And after May of 2011, Bitcoin miserably fell down to $2 over the next several months and stayed there for like over a year. And that was a very dark time, because that was Bitcoin's real first bubble. Everyone who called it like tulip mania and beanie babies felt completely vindicated. They had every reason to laugh at all the Bitcoiners who continued to tell them that this was still a thing, because they had the scoreboard at that point. So that was pretty rough. But for those of us who really believed in it, like it could have fallen another 90%, and we would have still been there, because we saw the utility of the system, and the price is important, but it is not the real value. It's just the price. So yeah, I've been through a few of these bubbles. I think a good way to explain their occurrence is that, take the thesis that Bitcoin is going to take over the world, or is going to become a massive part of economic activity. There's only 21 million of them, and so they will have to be worth millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars each at some point. So you can't have an asset go from $0 to $1 million per coin in a straight line. Because if that started happening, like let's say every month Bitcoin went up by 5% or whatever you need to compound that much, eventually, after enough months of that consistent, steady upward trend, everyone is going to see it as the greatest invention or the greatest investment ever, and they're going to start front loading it. They're going to start buying it up as much as possible, and the price is going to start appreciating past that average that it should stay at. And that causes a speculative bubble, because people will buy it up and turn it into this big hype cycle, as you mentioned. And that is by definition not sustainable. And it goes on for some period of time. And then for whatever reason of, the madness of crowds, the tides turn, the price starts falling, and people start getting scared. And then suddenly it's disaster, and they all sell, and it crashes, and then people are scared, and it stays below its average for a period of time. So I don't know that it can actually have any other pattern than these big speculative cycles. As it grows, the cycles will soften in terms of percentage terms, and as it becomes a bigger market cap, they will soften with time. But we should expect these cycles to continue for, probably a few decades, and to just be okay with that.
Right. You talk about like a few decades, that's a longer time horizon than a lot of people who I think it's worth noting. Then people mention who I think it's worth noting are a little bit newer to the game. than you are. Do you think there's something to that where, you've seen over the course of a decade a lot of different things happen? It's been, from one perspective, extremely fast, from, like you said, $5 a Bitcoin to, nearing 20,000, might be any day now. Like, you've seen the growth and how it's been, nothing has happened necessarily overnight, or, if it has, there's been 3 years in between.
Hmm.
How confident, I guess, are you in this time scale where if it does become something that's, and, I don't want to like get talking about price or anything like that necessarily, but to achieve its destiny, how confident are you that that's a multi-decade project as opposed to, say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I think Bitcoin's destiny, and when I use the term Bitcoin here, I mean Bitcoin or any other superior blockchain that might replace it,
Yeah.
which would carry on its attributes and still serve the same purpose. For Bitcoin to achieve its destiny, it essentially has to become the primary form of value in the world, where the most value is kept. It becomes the best form of money and the most liquid asset on Earth. By doing that, it kills fiat currency entirely. And so I think that has to happen within 20 years, and maybe it happens within 10. I don't think it's a struggle over 50 years. I don't think fiat is that resilient. I think fiat is going to fall apart as the debts of governments that print it continue to grow. So yeah, it's going to happen, not just in our lifetimes, but like over the next single generation. And if it hasn't happened within 20 years, then it probably means some other horrible thing occurred, and who knows where humanity is at that point.
Right. I want to, go off of what you just said about like printing money and how fiat, the illusion, may not last so long. You wrote a Medium post earlier this year that I read, during the thick of things with COVID, to, I guess, your company ShapeShift, which I do want to spend some time talking about soon. But you wrote about basically how Bitcoin was born for this, and how, the initial, people forget Bitcoin was created right after and really during the last financial crisis, during the recession. And even, you wrote about how the first Bitcoin had Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks kind of imprinted
Mm-hmm.
on the block. Can you talk about what you see in terms of the impact of COVID, whether it's kind of changed the track with Bitcoin and with crypto at large, or how it may have accelerated it, given that, the government's now printing a few $1 trillion this year, and who knows what next year?
Yeah. So there was just a discussion today or yesterday between Larry Fink and the head of UK's central bank, and this question came up about, to what degree has COVID accelerated digital currency adoption? And they were describing it in the context of, kind of all digital interaction between people has been accelerated by COVID because everyone is remote. And so maybe there's a bit of an effect in Bitcoin, but I don't actually think that's that material. What has actually been accelerated is the sovereign debt. So governments printing $1 gazillion or 2 gazillion, I don't even track it anymore. And that is just debasing of fiat. They're printing and creating money, which is the definition of inflation. They are debasing their currency, and that is the primary competitor to Bitcoin. So all they've done is, what would have taken 10 years is going to take 8 or something like that. They have accelerated the demise of fiat, and Bitcoin being here is more than happy to help the rest of the world get out of a debased fiat currency and into actual sound money.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to go back just to so that we don't miss talking about what you're currently working on. I kind of got off track a little bit when we started with your story, but let's come all the way to the present and talk about ShapeShift a little bit. How did you decide, this was the right way for you to stay involved with crypto and help build it out when you first started it?
Yeah. So when ShapeShift started, it was it was meant to just be a simple tool. I didn't really know that it would become a business, but a simple tool to convert one digital asset into another. And this was pre-Ethereum. This was 2014. So there were a number of altcoins. Bitcoin was still 98, 99% of the whole market cap. And all of the altcoins were essentially just trying to be a different version of Bitcoin. There's not a lot of differentiation. But my thesis was that digital assets in general were going to multiply wildly, that like something had been unlocked and digital assets were just going to be prevalent, and we'd go through this Cambrian explosion of these things. And so I was like, well, people need an easy way to convert one asset into another. It should be as safe and frictionless as possible. So with the initial version of ShapeShift, you would just send a coin into it and it would send a different coin out to you. It wouldn't hold onto your money. There was no user account whatsoever. And so it was a really awesome tool for that purpose. And then as Ethereum launched and all of the different digital assets started becoming more prevalent, ShapeShift grew with that whole wave. And then in 2018, when we had gotten pretty large, we were over 100 people, and the company was worth quite a bit of money at that point, and crypto was very much in the spotlight. Our legal position had always been a gray area, which we were comfortable with when we were small, but as we grew, we needed to really get clarity. And after paying literally millions of dollars to lawyers in many countries, we came to the horrible conclusion that we would have to implement KYC and an entire compliance program on ShapeShift and all of its customers. And this is something that I was and remain completely opposed to on ethical grounds. We don't need that information. We don't want that information. It's private and personal to the user, and innocent people don't deserve to be spied on. I don't know why that's an extreme position to take, but today it is. So we did it because we were essentially under the duress of government coming in and ruining our lives and stealing our property, throwing us in jail, and just making everything miserable. So we had a choice of like shutting down the whole company or trying to keep growing and building the company under the KYC regime. I think in hindsight, we should have just shut down. I think that would have been the right decision, but hindsight's always easy. And since then, KYC has been not just a burden on the company, but has completely gutted it. And the reason is that most of our volume came from other wallets that interacted with the ShapeShift API. And so their customers, when they wanted to convert coin A to B, the conversion would happen through our API. And so when we implemented KYC, it destroyed that user experience completely, because now those wallets would have to send their users to us, a different company, to go through a whole process of KYC. And obviously none of those users want to do that. Those other wallets didn't want their users to have to do that. So very logically, they all said, we're not going to work with you. And they just went with our competitors that were not as big and not as scared of the government's threats. So totally gutted the business. And, ever since then, we've been trying to rebuild and figure out what to do. And we actually have a pretty interesting announcement to make in about a month. So I won't spoil it here, but there's going to be another chapter for ShapeShift very soon. And I'll be excited to tell everyone about that when the time is right.
Well, yeah, I'll be excited to hear and to read about it. And I know you guys have taken a couple additional steps since the early days as well, focused on, people owning their keys, focused on zero commissions trading. I think you made an acquisition recently of a software wallet company out of Israel, I think. So certainly evident that you guys are, certainly not calling it and have something big lined up, it sounds like. So I'll be excited to see what that's about.
We've always been about self-custody and protecting users through, giving them control of their own keys, which is really fundamental to crypto. And, I'm very glad that the Coinbases of the world exist. I think they're very helpful for getting people familiar with this technology and onboarded. But the real power of digital assets and blockchains is that people can control their own assets completely. Not that they always have to, and not with all their assets, but that they have that ability. So ShapeShift has always been self-custody. Today, our platform allows people to hold and transact crypto without ShapeShift, the company, ever holding their keys. And so we make that easy for people. All they need is an email address and a password, and that creates their keys, and all their wealth is stored by them. We can't take it even if we wanted to. So we've always had that important message of self-custody. But I think it's been lost or mitigated to a large degree by the fact that while we try to protect people from a self-custody model, we are endangering people by taking their personal information. And people are rightly skeptical and averse to that.
And when you think about storing your crypto, or for the general public storing their crypto, I think one thing that I have some trouble with, and like I certainly don't consider myself like an expert in that realm. I'm much more familiar like conceptually with Bitcoin or different currencies and everything like that than like the actual storage. And so I struggle when people like tell me like, oh, I understand that Coinbase probably isn't the ideal given that it's not self-custody, but I don't really know where to point people to like a hard wallet. I have my own strategy, which is somewhat like diversified across a couple different options. But is ShapeShift a good option for someone who isn't really very technical at all, doesn't really play with technology, or maybe they're older or whatever it might be, but they're able to understand it when, like, for example, if I talk to them about Bitcoin and why it might be a reasonable investment?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we are not built for highly technical people. We're built for normal people that have learned enough about crypto that they care about self-custody, but we don't want it to be hard. So when someone is interacting with ShapeShift now, they can download the mobile app, and all they do is create an email and password, and the app on their phone is holding their keys. And so they don't really need to know that that's happening behind the scenes, but that's what is happening. So to a normal user, it feels roughly as easy as creating a account, on any custodial service like Coinbase. So we're trying to make it no worse of an experience to hold your own keys versus a custodian holding it for you.
Yeah, it sounds like smart, and I know a lot of the adoption is dependent, and crypto at large is obviously dependent on making everything more user friendly and easier for the less technical people outside of like the early adopter community. So,
Yeah, and
certainly,
it's certainly improved. And like, just last month when PayPal added crypto, obviously if someone's buying Bitcoin through PayPal and that's all they're doing, they're not really getting the full experience. But it's okay. It's okay, especially for a first step. And it is so damn easy in PayPal people are already familiar with that interface. They already have that account. They can click buy some Bitcoin and then it's just there. That's awesome for adoption. And what's then important is that as they start to learn that this is more than just a speculative asset, this is actually a financial revolution, and they should probably understand how it really works, because it will govern the future of humanity. As they come to that understanding, they can learn about holding their own keys and they can branch out into other services. But yeah, I'm certainly happy that the PayPals of the world are adopting this stuff too.
yeah, and it seems, I think I can't imagine for you, but even for me, just being a few years involved, every news story seems like it's like, oh, like this is happening, like everyone's getting on board, PayPal's in, and Paul Tudor Jones is talking about it and everything like that. But I think what people fail to realize, like I follow the Google trend on Bitcoin and a couple other like key terms pretty closely to try to help take an objective view on how popular it is and like how in the news and in people's
Mm-hmm.
attention it is. And it's crazy, like none of this is actually really it is moving up a bit, especially with the price, and who knows which drives the other. But it has been moving up a bit over the last month or so. But like even still, it's at levels similar to on a worldwide basis, similar to
Yeah,
like the halving.
we're nowhere near the bubble phase of this cycle. We haven't even breached the all-time high. Like the last cycle, when we were at the equivalent period in the cycle, we were about to breach, like $1,100. $1,100 Bitcoin was the peak of the prior cycle, and this would have been early 2017. Very few people were talking about it. It was not all hypey at that point, and yet it was seeing new highs. So this is going to be several months, 3 to 18 months of growth, and it's a time of high excitement. A ton of money is going to be made, a ton of money is going to be lost. All sorts of new people will get interested purely based on speculation. Some portion of them will actually understand what this is about, and they'll get involved, and the ecosystem will grow. A bunch of companies will get crazy amounts of funding. There will be huge blowups, and the whole ecosystem will just get gasoline thrown onto the fire with all the good and bad that comes with that. And if you're in this industry, you just got to be okay with that. That is the cycle. That is how a revolutionary technology encompasses the world. It doesn't do it in a straight and comfortable line.
Yeah, and I think I did have a couple more questions in mind, but I think that's actually a great way to wrap things up. I know we're coming up on time, and that was an interesting look into the future from the perspective of, like I said, one of the earliest people involved with all this, and certainly deserve credit for, your part in bringing this all to the larger adoption that it's accumulated over the years. Just before we wrap up, first of all, thank you so much again for taking the time and coming on the show today. Really enjoyed the conversation, but want to give you the opportunity, just wrapping things up, to point people to where they can learn more about ShapeShift. Where are you writing online, or people can follow you on Twitter or stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Erik Voorhees. Hard to spell that, ErikVoorhees. And then ShapeShift is just shapeshift.com. And check it out, try out the app. And if you want to learn about self-custody, that's a great way to do it. It's very easy. And the most important thing I think I can tell any of your listeners is that the least interesting thing about Bitcoin and crypto is the price. Like, if the stuff is cool because you can make money in it for sure, but it's really a fundamentally new paradigm for the world. And to learn how it works is really the most important thing. Understand what's going on, how it works, why it's so different than fiat and banks. Spend time, like hours, days, learning it, because it's going to change the world, and you will be better for that.